Welcome to Gen 365 podcast. This is an initiative of Beyond the Veil Mission. And this is a podcast for the community to empower a generation of healing and hope 365 days of the year. Before we begin, I want to remind you the meaning of humanity or Ubuntu. I am because you are. I am because we are. Therefore, to create a safe and brave space for all of us, we must remember that my healing is as good as my community healing. This is a podcast for everyone who loves the community. If you are listening to this new episode, I want you to remember that we see you and you matter. Welcome. Hi, Brent. Welcome to Gen 365 podcast. I think it is an honor and also grateful to host you. You are more than a guest. You've been with Beyond the Veil for a while, and we are always happy to hear from your knowledge, from your experience, especially in many ways that you have always supported our Rwandan community. So we are happy to have you today, having this conversation about the impact of trauma on youth, children, and adult sexual violence victims. I think this is always an important and, sensitive topic, telling our listeners today, if in any way you would like to just even stop listening or need any support, do not hesitate to send us a message. But we just, want to welcome first Brent, Welcome, Brent. Can you tell the audience a little bit who you are? Who is Brent, in the professional settings or even outside of your work? Who are you? Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, Lydia, thank you so much once again for having me. It's always my honor to partner with the Rwandan community to talk about these kinds of issues. And it's been so amazing to see how you've grown beyond the veil from just an idea when I first met you. It's just an idea to all of the amazing things you're doing now, including this podcast. So thank you so much for having me. And I hope it'll be a helpful time to anybody who's listening. So for me, I guess I hold a bunch of different roles, really. I am a trauma therapist for newcomers and refugees to Canada. So I work with the Canadian Mental Health Association of York Region and South Simcoe in partnership with an agency called Cedar Center, which is a trauma-specific agency, to provide trauma therapy for refugees and newcomers. And so with that, I've had the chance to work with people from all over the world, helping them to resolve trauma, but hopefully doing so in a way that's culturally appropriate for them, right? So that's one thing that I do. I also teach at a few places. I teach at, of course, Tyndale Seminary for a class for trauma there that I designed, but I also teach at York University and Lakehead Universities in their schools of social work on different topics like eating disorders, addictions, all kinds of different pieces, really. Whatever they need me to teach, I'll teach. And in addition to all of that, I've had the opportunity to travel, including to Rwanda. Before I met you, of course, I had the opportunity I stayed mostly in Kigali, but and just a little bit outside of there. But usually when I'm traveling, I'm doing teaching on trauma or other mental health issues. I've been to places like Malawi, Rwanda, Kenya, but also places in other areas of the world like Ukraine before the war happened there, and Lithuania and Dominican Republic as well. So yeah, it's just been an amazing opportunity that I've had to do these things. And so that's who I am in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brent. It's been always, a pleasure. I remember the ways we met, when we invited you to my sister 1-year anniversary, and and it's been a blessing. I think all the time God does his ways to, to connect people, and I've been blessed to meet you. And I think, on this topic, I think it would be the best that we start the conversation about the impact of trauma on adult sexual violence victims. If you are listening, the next part, because we're going to do 2 parts with Brent, we're going to talk, these topics, but with the focus on children and the youth. But for this episode, we're going to start on the adult part. And I just want to ask you a question. I've been always inspired by your work, and I think this has also motivated me to put my focus as a future therapist on working with individuals or families, who are survivors of trauma. And I just, need to know what inspired your work, because I see how you help different communities all over the world. What inspired your work to help, trauma victims or survivors?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I'm inspired by you, truthfully, just seeing, honestly, and I'm not just saying this, like seeing you take this vision that was, again, just an idea when we first started talking. And, again, it's been you, and I know you have a team of people helping you, but you've been driving this forward, so powerfully. And it's just amazing to see someone who, has captured a vision for this kind of work and who's just run with it. It's truly amazing. So you're one of the people who keeps me going, just seeing all the great things you're doing. So thank you for your amazing work. In terms of me, I mean, it's probably a long story that I'll just shorten just because it's probably will be a little boring. But like a lot of folks, there's probably many layers of things happening here. When I was a little kid, I always just had the sense I just wanted to be helpful. I just wanted to help people. And so for me, I thought the most obvious way to do that was just to be a doctor, right? So I actually was studying, trying to prepare to be a doctor, but I mean, just into high school. But then once I got to a certain level of high school science, I just realized this is not for me. I don't like it. I'm not doing very good at it, even though all my other grades were good. It just wasn't my thing. And so from that point on, I kind of had an idea of, I would want to go to social work to be helpful. And the thing that I think was driving this was just this idea that I wanted to be helping those who needed help the most. And, exactly where that came from, I don't know. I remember being a really little kid having this idea. Just that's what I thought my life should be about. And so I just pursued it. And, even though I guess you could argue that there's different populations who need help the most, right? Ultimately, I kind of landed with trauma therapy in this too. And to be honest with you too, without alienating any of your listeners, I didn't really mention it much in my introduction, but I'm also a spiritual man myself who follows a specific spirituality. And that's a huge point of, I think also of, well, it's maybe the driving matter really, because once I kind of realized, I didn't want to be a doctor. Then as a teenager, I actually started to pursue my spirituality and really began to understand that my life had a bigger purpose and that there was a specific thing that I was being called to do. And so it was something that it took years, right? Years of schooling, years of kind of, doing different jobs and things to get to where I'm at, of course. But yeah, so I would say that's the major piece. So partly just my personality and then really understanding, this calling that I felt. So it's kind of a spiritually driven sort of a thing. And, to be honest with you too, the last thing I'll say is, so doing this work, I think a lot of people would think that it's really intense or really sad or really scary. And it can be, right? But so often I am meeting people who are just so amazing and inspirational. And the courage that they have to face these challenges is truly remarkable. So I think that keeps the work going too, right? Not only seeing people like you, but also being inspired by the clients themselves and all that they're doing.
Absolutely. I think when we're thinking about having something like for a podcast, I've always, the main idea was like, how success look like in the mental health field, because we often see everywhere, if you want to be successful, it's more of like, on the business aspect, how much money you make, how, are you so consistent in your career? But when I thought about it, I was like, success in mental health is how we are able to go through each day, really, even, every single day we are able to go through. I think that's success for you. We have to allow, especially trauma survivors, decide how they define success. And thank you so much. You mentioned the spiritual aspect. I think faith, hope is something that keeps survivor going. And that's really beautiful. It helps us to see that beyond the knowledge and all the theories. There's always something to hold us, to keep us strong. And faith is one of that. Thank you so much for sharing. And
Definitely.
I need to ask you, I know by the time this podcast is out will be days or maybe weeks after the 16 days of activism, against gender-based violence. Usually from November 25th of each year, there's always a campaign about 16 days of activism against gender violence, and we can see that the numbers keep going, up. It's not like, there is a huge change we're seeing. And I'm wondering, is there anything that we are missing, to eliminate the violence against women? What do you wish the public and private institutions can do better to contribute to this goal? Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think that as a society here, we're really lagging behind in recognizing violence against women in society. And I think, when we think about violence against women, we typically think of physical abuse, and it is happening, and it is, like you said, it's rising, and it's still a terrible issue. But there's also the emotional and the mental forms of abuse too that really don't get recognized or really don't get talked about like in a broad way in society the way they should be. And I think the reason for this is that there still is, even though there's been lots of work that's been done and lots of advancement, I think that there's still a broad power imbalance in society between men and women. I mean, if you think about it, women don't have access to the same resources as men, financially speaking, typically, right? I mean, there's still a discrepancy between wages between men and women in our society, right? So there's that. There's also the sexualization of women in the media, which I think also basically structures, or I'm trying to figure out a good word, basically positions women to be on the receiving end of violence. Like that's sort of like what is shown in the media, that's the women's place in society, right? To receive this and just to not fight back, and and there's a lot of that in the media that I think really goes unchecked, that forms people's ideas and opinions. And I also think too, there is still a huge uneven distribution of labor in the family home with men and women, and this cuts across all various cultures. I think I think you'll see most times society, or in families, women are carrying the bulk of the labor at home and probably now expected to have a job too, and are put into these positions where they're really disempowered in a lot of homes, right? And so I think all of these things kind of lead to these issues of increased violence. And so I think as a society, we need to think about how we resolve these, so we can how can we help women to access more power in society? How can we address the wages, unequal pay? How can we change the way that the media presents women, right?
Yes.
And how can we help women to have more choice and independence in their lives? So these are huge issues, maybe beyond the scope of what we can talk about here necessarily, but all really important kind of structural pieces that we can be looking at to change society.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I like that you concluded with adding the aspect of, allowing women have power as well, because we usually talk about women empowerment, but then empowerment without power is useless, because, if we have many women in position, but they don't have the capacity to make those decisions, still,
Right.
There's something missing. And, two things I am grateful. I think more we talk about this, more we address these issues. And not only I appreciate you addressing this issue from a male perspective, because most of the time they're often addressed from women, and there is always, different idea there. And, there is a long way to go, but I think each one of us has to do their part and continue to learn better ways. And, I wanted to ask you, this question is more, towards men. Can you please touch on how sexual violence towards men look like, and why is it difficult for men to talk about it? Because when we talk about gender-based violence, I understand because women are more impacted, but at the same time, we understand that, men at the same time are also impacted. I think recently I was challenged when I learned that there is different ways aggression is exposed from men and women. From women, it can look like, relational aggression, and from men's side, it can be physical. That's why sometimes from women, it doesn't look like, there is a type of aggression there, but it helped me to change my perspective on how I see the issue or how men can be impacted. So can you touch on the idea how men are impacted as well? Thank you.
For sure. Yeah. Well, when you think about sexual abuse across all genders, there are like a baseline of symptoms that we'll probably get to a little bit later on, that everybody experiences, right? Mm-hmm. But for men, so yes, indeed. So acknowledging everything that we just talked about with women and the various pieces that they're dealing with, men also have some really unique experiences too. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way that men are brought up still in our society and across different cultures in our society too, right? So there's this impression that men can't be sexually abused. There's a lot of people who still believe that it's, there's maybe biological reasons, but also this macho idea that men can't be hurt like that. Like that would be weird for a man to be victimized, right? Or not only that, but also you can think of the understanding of sex and how sexualized our society can be. There's this idea that, well, yeah, if a man, if he was involved in something like this, he must want it, right? So all of these things lead to men not really liking to show themselves as being vulnerable. Yes. Right? I think that we still see, situations where little boys are conditioned to not cry or not show emotions or not be seen as weak. Like this is a huge, huge issue, right? If you're seen as weak, then that's really bad. You get bullied and things like that. So this is an issue because, once you have been sexually abused, first of all, men can be sexually abused, of course. And once it does happen, a lot of the same feelings and problems and symptoms that arise in like women also arise in men because we're human. But men are very hesitant to acknowledge these or reach out for help because they're not supposed to be vulnerable or be weak or be hurt this way. So what I often see in the work that I do is that men really try to wait to share about their pain, and they wait till their lives are just totally falling apart before they actually ask for help. Because I guess that pride or that, what would say, macho sort of view of like, hey, I'm a tough guy. I'm not going to need any help. Well, sometimes they kind of wait so long that the problems are so complex that it's really, really difficult.
Yes.
So that's a huge piece, right? So I think that men, generally speaking, they don't ask for that help, and we're conditioned to deal with these things on our own, which can lead to all kinds of problems for them.
Yeah.
And then if I can also say this too, this might also be a really important piece in any community that's listening to this, but maybe the Rwandan community too, is that I think that there is still some idea that people have, like if you are a boy or a guy and you're sexually abused by another male, then there's so much stigma about this because there might be some aspect of the boy thinking that he's gay or something, right? And so even though our society, wouldn't label, being gay as a negative thing or something, right? It's still in a lot of communities, let's face it. In a lot of communities, it's still considered an insult or still considered bad, right? And there's a lot of stigma attached to this. And so I think just that idea that, oh, this thing happened to me, therefore, with someone questioning my sexuality, well, because of that, I'm not going to come forward and ask for help, right? Because they don't want to be labeled that way. It's a huge barrier. And I've heard it from all kinds of people. I've even heard it from gay men before. Yes. Like, they were questioning, did this make me gay? And this is why I didn't want to come for help, because I was afraid someone was going to say that to me. And right? Just all the confusion that comes with that. So those pieces I think are really important. And then I guess, we can address these by changing the way that we bring up our little boys to be more in touch with their feelings, to ask for help when they need them, to be okay with being vulnerable. Maybe that will help some of these things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You touched a very important point. And I think over the years, observing the survivors community, especially sexual violence victims, I think what I try to tell them is that there is a community of many survivors out there. And I feel like, it's difficult finding help either from men's side or women's side, based on my experience, it's like, you have to be out there. You have to share that information in a public way, which is uncomfortable, because when you go public, then chance of getting justice are almost none. And when we go private, and when survivors go public, shame, and there's so much that come, with that decision. And I think, regardless of what can happen, I think freedom starts when we are able to, be able to share what happened to us, regardless of how other people are going to receive that, because it helps us, what it helps us to do is we're healing, we're moving forward, and it's a great step. No matter what, find a community out there, find people who can understand you. And even if when you can go public, which you don't have to, in any way, find anyone you can trust and talk with, because there's never any shame in finding healing. And I'm going to ask you, do you think, for example, give me 1 second, do you think the effects of sexual violence on the adult, does the impact look different between men and women, the way, they're impacted, the survivors or victims, does the impact look different?
Yeah. So, great question for sure. So one of the things that's really interesting about this is that many of the symptoms or many of the effects that we see from people who've experienced sexual violence, whether they're men or women, or transgender people for that matter too, to be honest, the symptoms are the same, right? So you have things like depression. Some of the effects might be anxiety, nightmares, problems trusting people, maybe, like I said earlier, questions about sexuality or just having issues with sex, sexual issues. A lot of people resort to using substances to deal with this pain. There might be self-harm or social isolation or physical problems, right? And so these are shared amongst, no matter what gender you are or what sex you are. Like, these are very common things that I see every day with people I work with.
Wow.
Who've experienced sexual violence. Yeah. However, so the effects for men and women might be very similar, but it might be experienced differently because, again, the women are more open to asking for help. So because the men wait so long to share because of, it's not socially acceptable for them to ask for help, they might not reach out, and they wait almost too late to ask. Not too late. There's always hope, but they wait till things are really, really, really bad and really complicated before they ask for help. So I think what we see is some things like, for instance, men will use different substances in a different way than women. I think men will tend to resort to things like hard drugs or alcohol faster than women would, because they have to keep it all. They can't ask for help. They have to deal with it themselves. Earlier, you talked about aggression and how that looks different, right? And so some men will lash out in anger that's maybe more physical or violent, whereas other women, it's a different kind of violence. It's more, like you said, like relational kind of things that happen, right? And I think too, when we think about society as well, I think, women will have the sense that they don't have the same control over preventing themselves being victimized again, right? So that I think that anxiety is really high for women. I see it in some men too, but it's not as much of a concern, right? Because they don't feel like they're being targeted as much as the women do.
Yes.
And then finally, that piece around sexuality, I've heard it a little bit from women, but I hear it much more from men who will say, am I gay because of this thing that happens? So again, some of the core, the core symptoms are very similar between men and women, but the way that they, I guess, live them out is different because of how they fit into society.
Yeah, I think I'm grateful that you share the impact, how it looks like, and the important part is to recognize that mostly it looks the same, and I think that can help us to have more compassion as well to men who comes out, sharing that they have experienced sexual violence, because, whatever impact women face, they do at the same time. And I think, some of the people that I know closely, who identify, or who have been raped as young boys, most of the time, that's sexual confusion, because I think the idea is that, it's the way sex was introduced to them in that moment that also impact them. So thank you. And I need to ask you, what role, we are speaking with you as a trauma therapist. Someone might be listening to this conversation, be like, from here, let me talk to someone. What role do trauma therapists play on the journey of a sexual violence victim?
Yeah, for sure. Well, for something as sensitive as sexual abuse, right? Like, I hope that what trauma therapists are supposed to do is we're supposed to listen like non-judgmentally, without judgment. We just listen to the person, right? A lot of what I do is just listening. And my clients are so grateful that, I'll sit and listen to them and kind of mourn with them as they share all this terrible stuff that's happened to them. So there's that piece that's really important. A trauma therapist should be confidential too, right? So they won't be telling what you're telling them to anybody else, even your family members, even your workplace or doctor or anybody. There will be no contact unless you give them permission. Yes. So I think that's important because people are afraid of, just like you said earlier, the courage it takes to share. If they share to a trauma therapist, does this mean it's going to get out to the whole world? And no, it wouldn't do that. That wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that trauma therapists do. We just listen. Another thing we do is we validate, right? So a lot of times people who report sexual abuse, and I have clients like this right now, someone I was meeting with just yesterday, who people in their life, important people, don't really believe them about what happened. They say, oh no, it didn't happen. Or they think, oh, just get over it, right? So they're totally not supporting the person. So trauma therapists will validate them. They'll believe them. They'll say, yeah, what did happen to you is wrong. And I believe you. And, we're going to work on resolving this for you. Right. So that's a huge piece that I think a lot of people don't get in their daily lives from their loved ones or people around them that they tell. Right. Even sometimes, the police try their best, but sometimes even they're skeptical when they hear about things. Right. Whereas a trauma therapist will at least start with believing you. And then if there's any reason not to believe you as the time goes on, then, we'll discuss it and figure it out. But yeah, very, very important. Wow. And then finally, a trauma therapist, we're just people too, right? But we are trained to help the person to resolve the trauma, to put it behind them, right? So that it's not like in the front of your mind at all times, or it's not like the major theme in your life, right? So that you can live life kind of feeling free from the effects of it, or at least, the decisions you make and the relationships you get into won't be as affected by the sexual abuse. Right. So there's different techniques that we're trained in and, different ways we can help people to resolve that. So that's what we do in a nutshell. Right. And I think that's the big piece that people are looking for. They just want relief they don't want to be defined by this sexual abuse that happened to them way back when or whenever it happened. They want to be themselves. And so the trauma therapist helps them to get back to that.
Wow. Thank you so much. I like that you mentioned the importance of having someone listening to you, because most of the time, survivors, especially sexual violence, anytime they share, it's like, provide more information. Why did that happen and all of that? So imagine being in a space where really your words are validated, someone is there to listen willingly. And not only that, I like to add the aspect of having techniques to help them, because, going to therapy or, a trained counselor, it's just beyond listening to you. They have techniques and ways they can help you to go through all of that. Yes. And I need to ask you, we often see people misdiagnosed, labeled, or wholly left in isolation of their problems. What are the aspects of not getting the root cause of trauma in case of sexual violence?
Yeah. So, this can be a big issue. I think a lot of people do this too, right? Like they address maybe other aspects, but it's almost too scary to address the sexual abuse, right? Because it is so painful. But if they kind of leave it, people try to ignore it, but it eventually comes out in different ways, right? It can lead to frustrating problems in life, in people's relationships. I see that all the time. Like they're not able to have healthy relationships because maybe they don't trust people, maybe they're having issues with sex, maybe, they're, the way that they see people has just really been changed by the sexual abuse. And so not dealing with it leads to these problems in people's relationships, right? It can also lead to issues, with things like people's jobs, if they're having a really hard time focusing on their work because of all the thoughts that are going around in their minds. It could affect their work life. Another thing that I see that's really interesting and it's tough for people is a lot of people have health issues after. Like if they are wrestling with a trauma or like, something like sexual abuse for many years, all the stress that's built up actually affects their physical health in really negative ways. And so it can lead to stomach issues, migraines, chronic pain, all kinds of things. There's some evidence that some cancers can be, brought on by this stress, like all kinds of different things like this. And so not to scare any of the listeners, right? Like, but it is, dealing with the core issue of sexual abuse can actually help with some of these things.
Yes.
And not only that, but of course, not really dealing with these things can also lead to a worsening of the symptoms I talked about earlier, like depression, anxiety, things like that, right? And those things then spread to other areas of the life where you're not just anxious about sexual abuse stuff, you're also anxious about other things in life because that's just the way that your body's been so used to functioning in. So, I guess there's a lot of evidence to say that, if you're able to work on your sexual abuse one way or another with a therapist or in some other way, it could be really beneficial for you, help you to not struggle so much.
Yes, that's, I think I remember you shared two things. One is how that can even affect your physical life. I think when I was in Rwanda this summer, I had a conversation with this lady. They work with widows of the genocide against the Tutsis. And they were saying how most of their clients were showing physical challenges, chronic illnesses. And the minute they started processing the trauma, most of them got better. No more, they were like, I was diagnosed with this, and they were like, oh my God, I don't have this anymore. And the problem was trauma, internalized trauma and all of that. And the other thing I think, I remember going to therapy myself when I was 30 years old. I remember processing something and I recognized, shoot, for 20 years, I lived believing that I was responsible for this. And for the first time in my life, I was the victim. So, I'm still processing that, learning to know the problem now to understand that I was the victim. But imagine spending 20 years thinking it was my responsibility. And I think many trauma survivors, especially on the sexual violence, I think there's a quote saying that rape or sexual violence is the only area where victims are treated as criminals. And that made sense. Many people live with, and they're even afraid to ask for help because it can be like, what if somebody think that I was responsible? Especially when they're adult, it's more of like, you are big, you are grown up enough to know what to do. So thank you so much for sharing the importance of, do what it takes so we can release the trauma from our bodies because, that's how the healing can happen. And just moving forward, in case of domestic sexual violence, what role does one in society narrative play in healing sexual violence trauma? Because I said this, my healing is as good as the community healing. And I think there's a huge gap in one person healing if the outside there's no understanding. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, I mean, what you just said too about someone's worldview being impacted by trauma and then holding on to that idea, like your own story. Thank you for sharing that. That's another thing I see too. That's another thing that wasn't on the list that I shared. So I just want to confirm that. Yes, like I have people that I'm working with, and for them, it's a very similar journey, like of learning how to not blame themselves for what happened. So this is very, very common. So thank you for sharing that. And in the case of things like domestic sexual violence, yeah, there's just a lot there to think about community wide. Like earlier, I don't know. I almost feel like people don't really understand that. Um, people people think that it can't happen in the home among partners, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
That sexual violence, if you're married to someone or living common law or whatever, then anything goes. But no, that's not the case. You can have sexual violence even in a situation like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of narrative serves to push this abuse underground, and people are not believed and it's not reported because they think, well, it was my husband. I mean, what am I supposed to do, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So that's a really, really difficult piece. But I would definitely agree with you that it's one thing for one person to kind of, go and get healing or work on themselves and move forward with some of these pieces around sexual violence. But if they're living in a community where the views are not changed and they're not challenged, this thing's going to play out over and over again for different people. And I do think that somehow there needs to be some kind of healing that happens across the community too. And it could just be education. Could be
Mm-hmm.
very much like what you're doing with this podcast, Lydia, right? Like just providing some education, changing some views, challenging some narratives that, are maybe violent or not supportive of people. And just helping people to understand what is going on with abuse and violence.
Mm-hmm.
Just this week, actually, I watched a video that someone showed me. It was
Mm-hmm.
actually from Malawi, and it was a video about sexual violence towards kids, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended by saying we need to change society in Malawi, and it was all done by Malawian people, right? So it's not like someone like me coming in who's not from Malawi and trying to change
Mm-hmm.
things. It was coming from within, and they're like, we need to change our society. We need to educate our kids. We need to empower our women. We need to teach our men to be more, caring and compassionate, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I think we need to keep promoting, right? Those kinds of ideas to change how our society interacts with these things and how we view, just like you said earlier, how we view victims and perpetrators and what to do with all those people.
Yes. Wow, thank you so much. I think we do our part, and inviting even our listeners in any way, whatever you serve, try to do your part and be understanding. And just, as we're speaking, I thought about one booklet you helped us to put together, Rwanda 365 trauma booklet. You can go on our website, www.beyondtheveilmission.com. It's just, a simple booklet that can help to recognize some symptoms of trauma, have a conversation with your family, because sometimes it can help. Sometimes we can see things we don't know. And I remember when I first came here to Canada, I started seeing things and understanding, and it helps me to have some of the conversation, even with my sister that we lost. It helped me to recognize that she was actually sick, because before I didn't know that she was in any way sick or impacted by trauma. But, learning and understanding the compassion, even become bigger, because I was like, oh my God, she's not, misbehaving in any way. She's actually sick. So it can be simple information like that. You can download the booklet, talk with your family, just, open a conversation. Just moving forward, can sexual violence victims heal completely? I know I've asked you these questions more than once. I've been privileged to be in one of your class. But I think it's the question many people always have. Can, sexual violence victims heal completely, or is it like grief, something that we learn to live with?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, of course. And I think the answer is going to be frustrating in a sense, because I think the answer is both. Right? I think it can happen where, you can really. So let me put it this way. If you've experienced sexual violence, it's always going to be a part of your story. It's always going to be a part of your life, right? It happened, unfortunately, of course. And it doesn't mean that we just accept it or that we, but it is something terrible that did happen, right? And of course, maybe some reminders of this will come up from time to time, for, and whatever the situation is. But I think that you can definitely learn to live with it to the extent that it really is like a past memory and not the major theme of your life anymore. So that really is like, so even though it's like you kind of learn to live with it, kind of like what you said about grief, right? at the same time, I think with sexual violence, you could get to the point where it's not the major part of your life anymore. Like it's just part of your background. It's just part of something that happened to you way back when or whatever. And even if you are reminded of it, you learn how to deal with it, and you know what to do if anything ever comes up about it, right? So, there's been all kinds of people I've worked with who've been able to move forward in their lives in really powerful, profound ways, and live really enriching lives, and they're not so depressed or anxious anymore, right? And they're not triggered by sexual violence anymore.
Yes.
But so, I guess it's a mixture of it, because I still think like, well, it's still part of your story, right? And like anything, there might be a reminder of something, and makes you sad for a few minutes, but I think that's normal, right? For anybody. So yeah. So I guess the answer is kind of like both. I think you do kind of learn to live with it, but in learning to live with it, you end up getting healed from it too, right?
Yes. I think it does better. I think it does get better. I think the most difficult part from trauma survivors, especially sexual violence victims, is like, the courage to open up about what happened. And I think, gracefully, if you can have an opportunity to just make a step, I think the restoration starts from there. And you are right, we learn to live with it. And I think not that it's gonna go somewhere, because that's part of your past, but at the same time, it's not gonna be as heavy as it used to be when it was still, inside you, not able to share with anyone. And more, if you have the opportunity to receive support or help, it helps you to normalize it in a way, not to make it small, but to understand that you are not alone, and there is always a community there that can support you and embrace you. So yeah, the first step, if any possible way, is to try to open up and share with someone. So yeah, I think we are done with this conversation. Again, we're going to have a second part about children and the youth. The same topic, but to conclude this, I need to ask Brent, especially that he works with the in the Toronto GTA areas. We would like to know if you have some resources that you can share with our audience, who have experienced sexual abuse, so that they can know how to seek help. You can even share any resource that can go beyond the borders of our community if you have any, so that would be helpful.
Sure. So maybe Shara talked about this before. Maybe we can come up, like I could send you a list of some of these places, but I'll just say it in case. So there's a place called Cedar Center. This is in New York region, which is just north of Toronto. Cedar as in the tree, right? CEDAR. And so this place is a trauma-specific place. It's actually where I work, but there's all kinds of other therapists too, who are trained to help people to manage these things. So that's a really good place, I think. There's a place called Across Boundaries in Toronto as well. This is a place that works with mental health for people who identify as people of color, or racialized people. So, lots of good services there. I know Family Services of Toronto, they do some good counseling, trauma counseling for sexual abuse. And they're also very aware culturally, I believe. So that's good. I know this is a bit of a long list, but I'll give you a few more. Women's College Hospital is another place you could look into if you're a woman. They have a really strong trauma program. It is a little hard to get into just with the wait list, but it's worth it. It's a very, very, definitely one of the big programs. Then there's a place called Barbara Schleifer Clinic. Again, maybe I'll give you a list that you can post with this. That's another great place that works with immigrants and newcomers and trauma. That's in Toronto. And then finally, in Hamilton, sort of Golden Horseshoe area, I don't know it as that area as well, but there is a place called the Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Care Center. And I'll just say the phone number now, but we can put it on the list if maybe 905-521-2100. That would be a great place to call if you're looking for help, and they can direct you, to the proper service in that area, because I'm sure there's some other services in that area too.
Yes. Thank you so much. And as you mentioned yourself, you are a trauma therapist. I would like to ask you, are you receiving clients at this time, or you are fully booked?
Yeah, well, certainly if someone were to reach out to me, I would definitely do my best to help them, either to work with me or to connect to a service in their area that makes sense.
Would you
So,
share your information on how they can reach you?
sure. Yeah. What I'll do is I'll give you one of my work emails, which is
Mm-hmm.
very, of course, confidential and only I access it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's BDIAZ. So B Diaz. Diaz is my last name
Mm-hmm.
at yorku.ca. So in other words, BDiaz at yorku.ca. And
Yes.
again, maybe that's something we can put
Absolutely.
on.
For sure, those resources, you shared that with us. By the time we post this podcast, we can share with the audience. And again, also we thank you during the pandemic. There is a few of the people from our community were able to help. And I always tell Brent, we have now work relationship in any way, but I wish I could be your client. But at the same time, I'm letting you know, the feedback we have received from Beyond the Veil, people were really happy to work with him. He has a great understanding of our community. He has worked with our community, and we chat a lot on what's happening in our community. So feel free, if you are from the Rwandans living in Canada, especially in this area, GTA areas, feel free to, you can even message us. We just provide his email. I don't be
That's
between
right.
you, so we don't even know what's happened. We even those people who gave me the feedback, they willingly came to me. I didn't know who was there, but they willingly came to message me. But usually, we don't even know who's messaging him. So that's why confidentiality is so important. Don't worry about it. If you want to reach out, feel free, honestly. Okay. So Brent, thank you so much. I cannot wait to have another chat with you. Finding ways to help children and the youth. And I see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That's it for the week. We hope you gathered your dose of resilience for the week ahead. Follow Gen 365 podcast to know when the next episode comes up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, or Google Podcasts. Share with your friends, community, and family, and do not also forget to follow and share feedback or questions on our community organization social media at Beyond the Veil Mission on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Or learn more about our work via our website at www.beyondtheveilmission.com. In the spirit of building resourceful, stronger communities, we can also help your community or business or organization to share your news and event on our podcast. Please email us for collaboration at podcastgen365@gmail.com. Thank you. Bye.